Has expired. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Mr Acting Deputy President, I'm not going to take lessons on tax reform from the Labor Party. No one in their right mind in this country would take lessons on tax reform from a party that has a record of absolute disasters and failures when it comes to reforming our tax system. They were only in government for 6 years last time, Mr Acting Deputy President, but they presided over failure after failure after failure on tax reform in this country. They put up a mining tax, an absolute failure. Only the Labor Party, Mr Acting Deputy President, only the Labor Party, maybe with the assistance of the Greens, thank you, Senator Whish-Wilson, only the Labor Party could design a tax which raised no money. No money. No money in net terms. It raised some small amount of money, but after compliance costs and administrative costs, no money was raised. All the hassle, all the rhetoric, all the rigmarole we went through in this country.
Senator Canavan, resume. You have a point of order, Senator Polley.
Point of order, and I would just remind you, through you, Chair, that there
Please.
has to be some relevance to the motion before us.
There's no point of order, Senator Polley. Continue, Senator Canavan. Just as I directed that way.
The motion is in regards to tax. The motion is, of course, a motion put forward by the Labor Party suggesting advice on tax to this government, and I'm making clear that not just the Liberal Party, not just the National Party, not anyone in their right mind in this country would take advice on tax reform from a party that presided over the disastrous mining tax. Indeed, it was a tax designed through the mishandled Henry tax review process as well, Mr Acting Deputy President, because that's not how we're going to run this process. We're not going to run it like the Labor Party did last time they were in government. That was an absolute failure. That was a lesson in how not to do tax reform. Because what they did with the Henry tax review, Mr Acting Deputy President, was to rule out lots of options. They didn't even let him look at the GST. Mr Ken Henry was the preeminent advisor on economic matters.
Order, Senator Canavan. Resume your seat. Senator Lyons, you have a point of
order. Mr Acting Deputy President, the matter of public importance does say the plan to increase the rate of GST, and I've yet to hear that being mentioned by the senator.
Senator Lyons, as I ruled when Senator Canavan took a point of order against Senator Cameron, there was a debating point. The same ruling against Senator Polley, and I ruled the same against you. There is no point of order. Senator Canavan, you have the call.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, because I think this motion does go to what the government is doing with tax reform, a white paper process, a consultative process, and it's important to contrast and learn from the mistakes of the former government and how they mishandled the tax reform process while they were in government, and they did mishandle it, Mr Acting Deputy President. I think anybody could deny that now. They instructed the most preeminent advisor on economic matters at the time, the then Treasury Secretary, Mr Ken Henry. They instructed him to not even look at the GST. They could not even have the guts, Mr Acting Deputy President, to take advice about the GST from their Treasury Secretary. That's how scared the Labor Party were of tax reform. And then they were so scared that when they received his report, which had nothing about the GST in it because he was told not to, when they received his report just before Christmas in 2009, Mr Acting Deputy President, Wayne Swan took it to the beach. He read it in between surfing trips, and he was so scared by it he wouldn't release it for 4 or 5 months. He kept it under wraps in his office for 4 or 5 months, did not put it out to discussion for the Australian people, was not brave enough and did not respect the Australian people enough for them to look at it and consider it and take into account what the views of the Australian people were. And what happened because of that, because it was then developed, the government's response, the then government's response, was developed in a cocoon, without input from the Australian people, without the antiseptic abilities of sunlight. We came up with a disastrous policy option of putting in place a mining tax which very few people could understand, which did not deal with the practical realities of the mining sector or the financial sector, and ultimately led to the destruction probably of a Prime Minister, or at least played a major role in the destruction of a Prime Minister. It was an absolute disastrous outcome, and we will not repeat it. We will not repeat it, Mr Acting Deputy President. We are confident that the Australian people can have a mature debate about the tax system. They can have a debate which looks at all elements of the tax system. And of course, the GST is one of the most important parts of the tax system. It raises over $50 billion a year. It's an incredibly important source of funds for our state governments, and of course it needs to be part of any review into taxes in our nation. Indeed, if you really believe the rhetoric of the other side about the GST, if you took Senator Cameron's contribution to its logical conclusion, and if Senator Cameron, through you, Chair, if Senator Cameron was was serious about the exaggerated and overwrought claims about the impact of the GST, why isn't the Labor Party taking a policy to remove the GST? Why isn't the Labor Party rolling back the GST? They've tried it before, Mr Acting Deputy President, but if you really believe what they're saying about this tax, that it causes devastation across our landscape, that it causes people to go into poverty and not be able to pay their bills, why aren't they taking a policy to remove it? Because if that's what they really, well, if that's what you think, Senator Lyons, through you, Chair, Senator Lyons, if you think it does those things, it would be incumbent on you to take to the Australian people a policy to get rid of the tax completely. But you aren't doing that. You didn't do that while you were in government. So what your claims right now are exposed as the complete political rhetoric they are. They are not based in what you really believe impacts people. They are based on a political argument you're seeking to have to focus on cost of living issues. Now, the irony here, Mr Acting Deputy President, is the only political party right now on this side of the chamber, we are having a mature debate about what our tax system should look like and how we can promote economic growth. On that side of the chamber, Mr Acting Deputy President, on that side of the chamber, they're proposing a massive tax which is going to hit poor people in this country. They're the ones proposing this tax. They're going to do it through another carbon tax. Just last week, we saw the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Shorten, put forward a 45% cut in our carbon emissions by 2030, almost halving our carbon emissions by 2030. The only way they're going to do that is from a new carbon tax or a new emissions trading scheme, which is another word for tax. They're going to put another tax on the Australian people if they get back in power. And guess who are going to be paying this tax, Mr Acting Deputy President? Guess who will be the people most exposed to paying Labor's carbon tax version 2.0? It will be the poorer households in our nation, just like it was last time. And the Australian people rejected that tax last time, but the Labor Party are coming back for a sequel. We know it will hit the poorest people, Mr Acting Deputy President, because the Labor Party did modelling on this when they were in government. They commissioned economic modelling from the Treasury when they were in government into this type of reduction, into a reduction of around 45% in carbon taxes, or 44% actually to be precise. And we know from that modelling then, from the experts, from the Australian Treasury, what would be the impact of such a tax. And the impact would be, Mr Acting Deputy President, that income per person would be $4,900 lower by 2030 if we were to implement such a policy. No one's asking us to do this policy. It's beyond the proposals from other countries in Paris right now. Yet the Australian Labor Party, the party that once represented workers, the party that was formed under a tree in Barcaldine to represent the shearers of our nation, are putting forward a tax which will reduce the average person's income by $5,000 a year, which will hit those industries which employ actual workers in this country, particularly in our steel, our aluminium and our power production sectors. Indeed, under that modelling that the Labor Party had on the carbon tax, all 37 coal-fired power stations in this nation would close. All of them. Now, I know, Mr Acting Deputy President, Senator Whish-Wilson and Senator Rice over there would be licking their lips at that prospect that 37 coal-fired power stations would be out of action. But it's not the stated view of the Labor Party. The Labor Party don't believe in shutting down our coal-fired power stations, yet they are pushing a policy which should have that very effect. And what are they going to say to the people of Hunter Valley? What are they going to say to the people of the Latrobe Valley? What are they going to say to the people of Central Queensland who lose their jobs because they're pushing a policy that's ideologically driven, not delivering a practical result for the environment and making us economically poorer? Because from that modelling, Mr Acting Deputy President, we know that the coal, oil and gas industry would be around 23% lower than it otherwise would be in 2030, that the coal mining output would be 42% lower, and the aluminium industry would actually halve under their modelling. Now, these are their figures. They're not my figures. They're not Senator McGrath's figures. They're not any ministers in the government's figures. They are the Australian Labor Party figures when they were in government about this particular policy option. It is complete madness. It is madness on stilts to be proposing such a tax which would hit the poorest Australians the most, and we wouldn't be able to afford compensation either because this policy actually reduces our economic growth. It would reduce our economic growth. While we, on this side, Mr Acting Deputy President, are focused on tax reform ideas which will promote economic growth, which will promote job creation. And yes, that might mean some change to the tax of our the mix of our tax system. Sorry, Mr Acting Deputy President, but that is how we're going to afford a bigger pie, which we can share among all Australians to fund all the services and public services we expect to be able to make sure every one of us would be better off as a result of that change, as was done with the GST. As was done the GST, the way you don't do tax reform is to put taxes on individual sectors of our economy, wealth-producing ones like coal, aluminium and steel, which would lower economic growth, shrink the economic pie and make it harder to make sure every Australian can have a better day tomorrow than they have today. That's what we are focused on, Mr Acting President. We are focused on making a brighter and stronger economy for the future, for tomorrow, than we have today, and we will do that through considered, well thought through and consultative tax reform. We will not impose massive new taxes on individual sectors of our economy which seek to divide our community, lower economic growth and make us all poorer.